I'm going to go ahead and bring us in on a new series. We went through the Old Testament for years, literally 3 years, and now we're finally moving in on the New Testament. I'm excited for this. So today we're starting a new series called The Fullness of Time. And what I'd like to do is bring your attention to Galatians chapter 4. I'm just going to go ahead and read 4 or 5 verses from Galatians chapter 4, the first 5 verses that are mentioned there in the text. And this will be the opening for this sermon series. Here we read, the Apostle Paul writing to the church at Galatia, he says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm." I wanted to read Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, not Galatians chapter 5. "Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ from a slave, although he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the day set by the Father. So also we, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." So we completed the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the 39 books that are found, right before that page in your Bible that says New Testament. And those 39 books are the law, the prophets, and the writings. If you turn over the back of your bulletin, I share with you the 3 highlighted verses that I'm going to be reading this morning. I already shared with you Galatians 4, 1 through 5. And then you'll also notice I gave you an outline of the Old Testament. So you have the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings in the Old Testament. Here in the New Testament, which we're going to talk about this morning, and if you need a title for this morning's message, it's Introduction to the New Testament. I'm introducing you to this topic. And in the New Testament, you have the Gospels, the Epistles, and the book of Revelation. So that would be your 3-way of your outlining of the old and the new. So we're still studying through the prophetic books. We completed the historical narrative, if you will, of the Old Testament from Genesis to 2 Kings, or Chronicles for that matter. And that pretty much brought us from the beginning when God started covenanting with Israel back in, some people would say the beginning of time. And obviously through the giving of the law of Moses, through the unfortunate fact that the people did not listen to the law of Moses, were cast out of the land, both the north and the south. And then we had found ourselves in Chronicles where they've been returning, and we just noticed that this wasn't the time of promise. Last week I concluded by helping you understand what we call the intertestamental period, where from Malachi up until the book of Matthew, we just find 400 years of silence. Hopefully last week I impressed upon you that it wasn't a silent period. Rather, it was a rather providential period where God was working in the midst of silence. Yes, it seemed silent, meaning no prophets were being sent to Israel. They were sitting there wondering and leading themselves into further confusion by leaning on their own understandings, creating different sects and different versions of their faith, so that by the time Christ comes into the world, born of a woman, born under law, they are completely confused. They don't see the promise right in front of their faces. Now, we're still studying through the prophetic books. So we're still in the Old Testament in our adult Sunday school. That is my invite, of course, that if you want to continue to learn, and you'll see as we read the New Testament, how important it is to really have a healthy understanding of the Old Testament prophets. So again, that's why we're continuing to study through them in our adult Sunday school. Also, one of my goals is after we complete the New Testament is I want us to actually go back to the beginning again and rework through the whole Bible so that we could create a course so that people would be able to understand these things. And one last thing I'll say as an introduction. Last week I ended the Old Testament with a cliffhanger, right? I said the Old Testament is a cliffhanger, meaning that it kind of brings you in on another story. It ends, but it doesn't end. It's like, well, what's going on here? And what I had mentioned was that we see an end of an exile coming, right? The prophets are promising Israel that you've been exiled. Israel of the flesh, they think, well, yeah, we were outside the land. But we see that Ezra and Nehemiah still refer to them as slaves and exiles even after they get back into the land. Because we know the goal was never for God to have them in a specific place at a specific time, but rather for them to be a people that have set their hearts and their minds on him. So, yes, you could be back in the physical land, but if your heart and your mind are not focused on God, you are still exiled. It's as though you're not in the land. And that's where Israel finds themselves when we move into the New Testament. is, yes, they're in the land. They're under the Roman rule in the land of Judea. However, they're not living the promise. So they're still exiles. They're still exiled from God. They're still far away from God. And obviously we know that the Messiah is born into the world. So the Old Testament ends where Old Covenant Israel was these people that were given a promise that God would come dwell with them. And again, hopefully we see all throughout the biblical story there's a war being fought, a natural and a spiritual war. We see when we start with Cain and Abel, right? Cain was that firstborn son who's supposed to have the inheritance. What happens? Cain kills Abel, then Cain gets cast out, and then Seth comes. Seth is the child of promise rather than Cain, so Cain is cast out. Cain was the fleshly child that was supposed to obtain the inheritance, but he gets cast out, and Seth, the child of promise, obviously is what we read through the rest of the biblical story. We know that Ishmael and Isaac, Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. He had Ishmael, a fleshly son, his firstborn son that should have received the inheritance. But again, we see the spiritual picture of a child of promise, Isaac. And Isaac is born and Ishmael is cast out. Then we see the picture of Jacob and Esau. Esau being the firstborn son, supposed to get the promise, but we see it was a spiritual reality that Jacob would be the one that would get the promise rather than Esau, who was born first. And the reason I tell you all of that is because in the Old Testament, we're reading the story of God's fleshly son, Israel, the corporate nation of Israel. They are called the Son of God, when God led his son out of Egypt. Who was that? That was the Old Covenant Israel. So then we also read now, when we take the whole Bible together, in the first century, we find that we have fleshly Old Covenant son, Old Covenant Israel, the Jews that had returned from Babylon. And then you have this spiritual son, those that are setting their eyes on Jesus, who become children of God, as per Romans chapter 8. So, and we know in the first century that the physical Jews, the fleshly son of God, so to speak, the Jews, who considered themselves heirs of the promised things, waged war against the spiritual child of God, the body of Christ, the church. And we've seen that take place in the first century. Max King refers to this as the spirit of prophecy, which is something Edward and I have been talking about on our Preterist Power Hour. So in the first century, again, to bring your attention to that text in Galatians chapter 4, Israel, physical Israel, thought they were the heirs of the promised things to come. All that would come to be theirs in the age to come. However, what we learn as we discern the spiritual things through Scripture is that physical Israel was never the heir. It was those, the remnant, that would have their heart and a mind for God. Yes, some of fleshly Old Covenant Israel would participate in the glorious riches of the age to come. However, that was not the substance of the people of God, and that's why we read in Galatians chapter 4 that the heir was a child, meaning the remnant. The remnant was a child, and it was growing and growing, and by the time we get into the first century, we see that it says, while we were children, we were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. What more would that be other than the law of Moses? That's what they were held in bondage under. But then when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. And now notice this. Notice the point of everything. Verse 5. So that he will redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive the adoption as sons. Now, we were never under the law. But again, by and large, the biggest part of the Messiah's ministry, where he said, I came to call the lost tribes of the house of Israel, was to redeem those that were under law. And of course, we know through his redemption of those that were under law, he reached out to the Gentiles, those that were not under law, and brought those that were called and appointed by God, elected by God, to receive salvation. He called them to him. So hopefully you're just seeing the purpose. That's the purpose of the Bible. So that God would redeem, not so that God would take you and bring you somewhere else. That's not what we're going to be reading about in the New Testament. We're going to be reading about how God, after this whole story that we've learned about for 3 years, was so patient with Old Covenant Israel, just trying to get them to focus on him. And we read, again, the time and time again, where wickedness ran rampant, they did not listen. And what we're going to see here is how the Lord goes about redeeming his people. Yes, some of them are going to come from Old Covenant Israel. But we're also going to notice in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul says, not all Israel are Israel. In other words, not all the fleshly people that are calling themselves Israel are truly of those that are of God. And that's what we're going to see. The question becomes when we move into the New Testament, well then who are those that are of God? Who are the people of God? And we're going to see that as we move into the New Testament details. Now, today what I want to do is give you a little bit of an outlining of the New Testament. It was a early church father, Augustine, who once said, "The things that are under a veil in the Old Testament have been revealed in the New Testament." So again, I love contrasts because they often highlight what we need to be looking at. So the question would be, what's hidden in the Old Testament? And obviously when you become familiar with the Old Testament, hopefully, again, 3 years now, hopefully we get the picture. Righteousness. Where is righteousness? The people of God cannot manifest it. God doesn't seem to be showering it upon them. It just seems, when we read the Old Testament, all we see is wickedness running rampant. So the question becomes, where is righteousness, and how will the people of God ever be righteous? Again, God had told them, if you listen to me, I will bless you. Who doesn't want to be blessed? So the question becomes, how will the people of God become blessed? If they listen to him, but the problem is, and again, hopefully we know this, righteousness has to do with listening to him, right? If you listen to him, you're declared righteous. But as we read through the Old Testament, we realize people in and of themselves could not make themselves righteous, could not listen to the things of God. And that's what's hidden in the Old and what's going to be manifested or revealed for us in the New. Dallas Willard, he said it another way. He said, the New Testament, once you understand the Old, is simply a natural consequence. And the reason being is because God is faithful. And God is promising, as you've been reading through the Old Testament, doesn't he say again and again, I will restore you, as Andy rightly shared in our responsive reading this morning. Come to me and I will cleanse you, which again is a beautiful messianic prophecy. So we see that it's the New Testament becomes a natural consequence of what we read in the Old Testament. If God is faithful, he's going to bring forth righteousness, and his people are going to be made righteous. The question is, the mystery is, to look back at that quote from Augustine, where is it? How is he going to manifest? How is he going to make people righteous? And again, we're all gathered here in a Christian church in the 21st century, so perfectly we all know how. We know what the mystery is, but now we're going to discover it as we study through the New Testament. It's he provides the righteousness. We could never be made righteousness on our own. So he provides Jesus, who becomes our righteousness because he was able to listen. He listened to the things of God. He obeyed the commandments of God, and we follow in his footsteps. That's why it says in Matthew chapter 6:33, I love that text. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, not a righteousness of your own, and all things will be given to you. So again, we do know the story, but we're going to do the studying to see it revealed. We know it. We know that his righteousness has been provided to us. That's how the people of God were made righteous. That righteousness, again, that's what Jesus is everything that the law and the prophets foretold and had said was going to come. Kenneth Gentry said, Jesus is referring to all things written in the Old Testament. So again, when he's speaking about himself, he's referring to things that are written in the Old Testament. So that's why we spent 3 years studying through the Old Testament, to become as familiar with it as we can. Being intellectually honest, anyone can notice that the New Testament prophecies are reiterations of the Old Testament. So again, another reason why it's very, very important to become familiar with the Old Testament. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 56, Jesus says, "But all of this has taken place so that the writing of the law and the prophets might be fulfilled." So again, notice that. Jesus is saying everything that's happening in his time is happening so that the law and the prophets can be fulfilled. I make a remark here in my notes. Without diligent understanding of the Old Testament and Hebrew history, one cannot develop a diligent understanding of Jesus' teachings or the New Testament. So again, that should remind us that when we're talking about Old and New Testament, we're not talking about, oh, the Old Testament, that was for the Jews. You know, that book. That's why you unfortunately have these Bibles that are, half a book, where it's these, just, the New Testament, something that constantly frustrates me, because you're not going to understand the things in the New Testament without understanding what was going on in the Old Testament. And unfortunately, we know by and large in Christian communities, people just kind of guess what they think Jesus is talking about in the New Testament, or add their own interpretations to it, because they don't know what's going on in the Old Testament. They add their own color and flavor to the text. One writer said, if we allow Christ in the New Testament to open our understanding, we will see that all the centuries of Old Testament era were merely a part of the progressive unfolding of God's eternal and unchanging purpose, which he proposed not in the nation of Israel, but in Jesus Christ our Lord, which we read in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 11. So again, the whole point of the Old Testament was to point to the New Testament. The whole point of 39 books of the Old Testament were to point to the 27 books of the New Testament. So again, I mentioned this chart on the back of your, hardly a chart, on the back of your bulletin this morning, just helping you see. Old Testament we summarized, well, the Jews summarized, as the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. I'm summarizing for us the Gospels. There's 5 Gospels. I know that sounds strange to everybody, but there it is. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. Acts is a part of the Gospel story. It's a part, matter of fact, Acts was supposed to be a part of the book of Luke. It's just a continuation of Luke's writing. So we have 5 Gospels. We have 21 epistles in the New Testament. And we have 1 book of Revelation. And obviously, as we study through the New Testament, we'll see why we mark out the book of Revelation different than the Gospels and the epistles. So, matter of fact, I'll share a little bit with you this morning. The 4 Gospels, what do we see when we open up the Bible? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are 3 of these are what they refer to as the synoptic Gospels, which means taking one look. One look. And what you have is Matthew, Mark, and Luke are giving you one look at the ministry of Jesus through 3 different lenses, 3 different types of people. You have Matthew, who wrote his gospel in Hebrew and was writing to the Jews that were there in Judea and helping them about 10 years after Jesus was on earth, helping them understand what was going on with Jesus. Who was Jesus? What was his story? Then you have Mark, who writes around the same time, about 10 years after Jesus Christ ascended into heaven. And Mark's writing for the Greek-minded Jews that are living in Judea. Because we know also that the Hellenism had its influence in the first century, which I shared last week. And so then you have Matthew, Mark, and then you have Luke, who is a Gentile doctor, who's actually going to explain to the Gentiles this story of Jesus. And then John, who comes a little bit later on, John writes from the angle of, let me prove that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And he goes about most of his book looking very different than the 3 other sketches of Jesus' history. Again, once you understand why they're writing and to whom they're writing to, it becomes a bit clearer of the details that are found in those texts. The Acts of the Apostles is exactly that, the Acts of the Apostles. So after Jesus Christ ascends into heaven, you begin to see the work in the book of Acts, which Luke wrote. You see what they did and where they went and how this story just continued to go on. It didn't end with the ascension of Jesus. It was, a mission. And we read through the book of Acts how that mission, all the way up till about, I think it's safe to say about 62 AD, the book of Acts brings us up to the Apostle Paul on the, being arrested in Roman. He's basically arrested and being held by the Romans in Acts chapter 28. So it brings you through quite a bit of history. Then you read the epistles. Now there's 14 epistles by the Apostle Paul. And I would say 14 because there's 13, but then the book of Hebrews, which is a book that's often thrown up in the air and nobody knows who wrote it. We're going to have to discuss that. The book of Hebrews was written by the Apostle Paul as well, in my opinion, and I believe that we'll lead in on those details. Then you have 7 what they call Catholic epistles, and it's strange to hear about a Catholic epistle in a Protestant church, isn't it? But again, the term Catholic simply means universal. So, please get the institution down the road out of your head and instead think of the term Catholic as being universal, meaning these writings, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude, were written generally for a universal message kind of sent out to different people in different places. Matter of fact, I believe James starts his letter to the scattered saints throughout Cappadocia, all these other places, Bithynia, a bunch of places that some of you might not even know exist. Or for that matter, don't exist anymore anyway. But again, they sent out these letters to these scattered people. And then the book of Revelation. And again, the reason why Revelation is in a category of its own is because of the style of writing. I'm sure some of you have maybe ventured into the book of Revelation at some point or have studied with me through the book, and you know that it's full of apocalyptic language, very much like the prophetic books of the Old Testament. So again, another reason to highlight why it's important to become familiar with the Old Testament literature is because it's often used in the New Testament, book of Revelation being a very important one. Historian Michael Grant, because again, one of the problems that we see when we read about the New Testament is people seem to say, well, how do we know that these writings are true? I want to share with you what historian Michael Grant said. He said, if we apply to the New Testament, as we should, the same sort of criteria that we apply to other ancient writings, containing historical material, we can no more reject Jesus' existence than we can reject the existence of a mass pagan personage whose reality as a historical figure is never questioned. Nobody ever denied that Nero Caesar, for example, existed. Nobody ever denied. I'm trying to remember some of the other writings that are out there. There's a famous series called The Truth Project, and I love where they lead in on this topic here. Again, because there are people that believe Jesus never existed, which should cause you to laugh. But, no, the Jews believe Jesus existed. They just don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. There's people on this earth that actually believe Jesus didn't exist, which, again, just error, simple historical error. There's more evidence to Jesus existing than most of the historical figures that we take for granted, that we think we know about, or that we just kind of accept existed in history. Ed Stevens, a name that I imagine many of you have heard, he says, too many Christians are unaware of all the historical circumstances that were involved in the production of the epistles. As a result of that historical ignorance, all they can do is speculate about what these writings mean. And you would not believe the amount of sheer nonsense and confusion that has been written in some of the commentaries, whose authors had no clear understanding of the historical background. No wonder they vary so much in the interpretations of these writings. They have severed the book from the historical connection, which are the only connection that can give them an understanding of the message. Now you see why you must be serious about getting a grip on the first century history. It is key to understanding and unlocking the writings of the New Testament. So again, as we go through this journey, this isn't going to be me pulling out my favorite teachings of Jesus and just teaching you through the Beatitudes or something. We're going to be learning the history of the first century and how all of this locks into what we're reading about in the New Testament. And of course, we will gain some teaching for ourselves, or gain a lot of teaching for ourselves, but that is not going to be the way that we go about understanding the New Testament. Andrew Perryman, a writer I enjoy, he said, it requires a considerable leap of the imagination to shift from universalizing, through the universalizing theological model of salvation to a particular linear historical model of salvation. But it has to be done. Certainly it has to be done for the sake of an intelligent and consistent understanding of the New Testament. Because again, the problem is that in our current Christian theological understanding, you have people that are all too quick to find application. Just kind of, make it mean what you want. And if it doesn't mean what you want, make it mean it. That's kind of where most people are going. They're just making the truths very abstract, very universal. Well, this is what it means to me. This is what it should instruct all of us to do. Many of you have heard me talk a couple of years back when I was trying to explain the flight from Jerusalem in the first century of the Christians. A man told me, no, you're getting too much in on the history. That is talking about all Christians fleeing tribulation. I said, no, it literally says flee from Jerusalem. He said, you're not understanding. The spiritual interpretation of Jerusalem is your heart. And I obviously at that point I had nowhere to go with the conversation. I said, you're totally abusing the Bible. That's not the way that we read the Bible. We don't just make it a universal truth and then apply it somewhere. We find out what it meant to the original audience, as Edward was reminding us earlier in our responsive reading, and then we get an intelligent and consistent understanding of the New Testament. And dare I say, we need to do that. Because again, we have so many people in our world that are laughing at Christianity, deride Christianity, feel that Christianity has no power. And maybe one of the reasons is because Christians have made such universalizing statements of the things of Scripture rather than helping people understand what it actually means in its own context. A narrative historical reading of the New Testament suggests that the gospel is the proclamation of what God did for his people during a time of an eschatological crisis. The personal dimensions of the faith have to be worked out in light of what it meant for the first century people. One consequence is that at the personal level of evangelism, sometimes we may seem like we don't have a lot to offer in regards to salvation, other than historical teaching. But that's not the case. We see that through this historical teaching, it's inviting us all, even today, into contemporary day, to become a part of an obedient community that bears witness, always fallible, always on the basis of grace, to the full scope of creational righteousness. Again, Elder Steve had shared in our adult Sunday school this morning that God rejoices in creation. And I believe the biblical narrative, what it points out is, through this whole story, through what God did with Old Covenant Israel and what he's doing through his New Covenant church, is to help the world see how much God rejoices in his creation. That's our job. That's what Old Covenant Israel failed to do, to paint the picture of who God is and display that to the nations around them. And then God has created his church to do that. And that's what we read about as we move into the New Testament. So in conclusion this morning, hopefully I've whet your senses for what we're going to be looking at. Augustine once said, in the Old Testament, the New Testament is concealed. In the New, the Old is revealed. Prayerfully, you have continued to gain understanding as we have been thinking through the Scriptures and discerning the mystery in the Old Testament. The question becomes, how will God provide righteousness and salvation to a stubborn, rebellious people? In the New Testament, we begin to see the unveiling of the mysterious messianic hope. Again, we see God's timing right on display here. The fullness of time. So what this is we're moving into the New Testament at the end of a period. That's going to, again, Jesus is born at the end of a period. That's something very important, to kind of relate to you, is that most people pick it up, they think Old Testament, old story, New Testament, the story that we're living. And that's not true. The New Testament is simply a continuation of what we're reading in the Old Testament. So we need to get that in our mind, that we're reading the end of a story as we move into the New Testament. We're not reading the beginning of a whole new story. We're reading the end of a story that will begin anew as we move through the time of the New Testament. This morning I highlighted some important details regarding the New Testament, and it is with these details that we will move into our reading and studying through the New Testament. Next week we're going to begin looking at the Gospel of Matthew and all that was being said about him. All that was being said about him. We're going to look into Matthew, and matter of fact, Matthew writes 10 years, as I mentioned before, 10 years after Jesus Christ. Now, before I go ahead and move on, I want to just share a couple other things with you because I noticed I read 2 pages of different notes, so sorry about that. But there's a paper that was handed to you before we started this morning. It should look something like a paper that I don't have up here. History of the End? Okay, perfect. This is important to hold on to, and I'm going to actually give you something to write on the back of your bulletin. If you want to read along with me this week, I'm going to encourage you to read Matthew chapters 1 through 8. And that's what we're going to lean in on next week. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 1 through 8. The way I broke it down, Monday you read Matthew chapters 1 through 2. Tuesday you read Matthew chapters 2 through 3. Wednesday you give yourself a break, read one chapter, Matthew 4. Thursday read Matthew 5. Friday read Matthew chapters 6 through 7. And Saturday read Matthew chapter 8. And then join me here and we'll talk about it next Sunday. The reason I'm giving you this is going to give you a lot of first century history. I just talked a lot about history and things you should know. So this will give you a good amount of history. And also, if you turn it over to the back, you see the dates for the New Testament writings. That's going to be another part of your arsenal in regards to understanding the New Testament. So what we're going to do, instead of the way your New Testament is put together, most people pick up the Bible, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to follow these writings as they were historically presented. So we're going to read Matthew and Mark, and then we're going to go over to Galatians. And we're going to follow the historical chronology of how these New Testament letters were given to the churches. So my goal, for example, is going to be next week to take you to what it was like to live 10 years after Jesus Christ in the land of Judea, and then receive this gospel from a man named Matthew, that tax collector that was following Jesus, and read about his truth. So that's how we'll be leaning in on the texts in front of us. And if I may just share one last thing about the New Testament canon. Because many people hold this book up and they say, well, then how do we get the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament? Are there other books? How do we know these books are reliable? And I'm just going to share with you a little church history. The Muratorian canon, as it was called, is believed to date back to the year 200. It is the earliest compilation of the New Testament canonical texts that we read today. Again, canonical means they were actually accepted to be a part of this book. The 2 books that we're actually missing that were in the Muratorian canon that are not in ours are the Apocalypse of Peter and the Wisdom of Solomon. It was not until the 5th century that the different Christian churches came to a basic agreement on what the biblical canon would hold. The 27-book New Testament was first mentioned in the Easter letter of Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria in the year 367, and was first formally canonized during the councils of Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 in North Africa. Pope Innocent I ratified the same canon in 405, but it is probable that a council in Rome in 382 under Pope Damascus I gave the same first list. So again, that's how we get our New Testament is from the 4th century BC, 4th century AD. We know church leaders decided these are the most reliable. That's not to say that there's text outside of the Bible, because again, as we're going to lean in on the New Testament, we're going to see you have to gain information outside of the New Testament, or some things won't make sense. For example, the Apostle Paul quotes from a poem of the Gentiles. Well, if you don't know what that poem is, it makes no sense. Then we see there's going to be quite a few different places as we lean in on the New Testament that we're going to seek outside sources, or we're going to use other writings, even writings that some may consider spurious up to this day. But it all leads in on our understanding of the New Testament. So I encourage you, my exhortation in closing will be to be open-minded, to do the study, to do the reading, and, as Edward rightly exhorted us, to do the study. Reading is not study. So we need to do both. We need to be really paying attention. I encourage you this week, read through Matthew chapters 1 through 8, and let's really dive into the New Testament and see it for all that it's worth. And with that, I'll go ahead and pray,